If silence could speak, it would sound like footsteps echoing through places the world has already forgotten. At 0400 hours, just before the first light could touch the broken edges of the horizon, Sergeant Ethan Walker stood at the edge of Camp Holloway's outer perimeter, watching a German shepherd named Shadow behave in a way that made every instinct in his trained mind go still. The air was cool, carrying the faint metallic scent of old equipment and dry earth, the kind of air that settles over places where history refuses to leave. Shadow wasn't pacing like he usually did. He wasn't waiting for command. He was focused, head lowered, ears locked forward, staring beyond the fence line toward the distant silhouette of what used to be a war zone and was now only called the ruins. Ethan narrowed his eyes. In 8 years of service with the United States Marine Corps, he had learned to recognize patterns before they became problems, and this was not a pattern he had seen before. Shadow took one step forward, then another, slow and deliberate, as if he had heard something no human ear could detect. Ethan called his name once, calm but firm, the kind of tone meant to pull a trained K-9 back into discipline. Shadow paused, but did not turn. Instead, he let out a low breath through his nose, almost like a decision had already been made. Ethan felt it then, that familiar tension between protocol and instinct, between what he was ordered to do and what he felt was already happening. The ruins lay less than a mile beyond the perimeter fence, a stretch of collapsed concrete structures and overgrown pathways, where a former operational zone had been shut down after years of conflict and evacuation. No active mission was scheduled there. No authorized personnel were supposed to enter without clearance, and yet Shadow had already begun walking toward it. Ethan stepped forward and grabbed the leash, but there was no resistance from the dog, only direction, as if the leash itself had become unnecessary. He loosened his grip slightly, confusion tightening in his chest. Shadow never broke formation like this unless something was wrong. Not just wrong in the way machines fail or systems glitch, but wrong in the deeper sense, the kind that sits under instinct like a warning no one fully understands until it is too late. The morning wind shifted, brushing through the tall dry grass along the fence line, carrying with it the faint scent of dust and something older, something that did not belong to the present. Ethan's memory flickered briefly to training days when they were taught that K-9 units sometimes responded to emotional cues long before humans could process danger. He had always respected that theory, but respect was not the same as belief. Until now. Shadow crossed under the broken section of the perimeter fence without hesitation. Ethan followed immediately, boots pressing into uneven ground, the terrain changing subtly with every step away from base security. The world here felt quieter, not peaceful, but emptied, like sound itself had been stripped away. In the distance, the ruins rose like a forgotten skeleton of stone and steel, half-collapsed walls leaning into each other as if still trying to stand for reasons no longer relevant. Ethan adjusted his pace to Shadow's rhythm, watching every movement the dog made. Shadow's nose stayed low, tracking something invisible, his body language shifting from curiosity to urgency. Ethan could feel it now too, not as information, but as pressure, an unspoken weight that grew stronger the closer they got. He did not speak. There was nothing to say yet that would make sense of this. Instead, he trusted the only thing that had never failed him in the field, observation. As they approached the outer edge of the ruins, Shadow stopped abruptly. His body stiffened, not in fear, but in recognition. Ethan stepped beside him and looked ahead. The structure in front of them was partially collapsed, a wide opening where a wall had once stood, now leading into a shadowed interior where daylight struggled to enter. Dust floated in the air like suspended memory. Shadow took one slow step forward, and then another, each movement precise, as if he were following a line only he could see. Ethan felt his pulse steady, controlled, but alert. Something was inside. Not a threat in the conventional sense he was trained for, but something that pulled at attention in a different way, something that made even silence feel like it was waiting. Shadow stopped at the entrance and turned his head slightly toward Ethan for the first time since they left the base. It wasn't a command, not exactly, but it wasn't hesitation either. It was invitation. Ethan exhaled slowly, eyes scanning the dark interior ahead. Whatever lay inside those ruins had already changed the way Shadow moved, and in Ethan Walker's experience, That meant the world beyond this point was no longer the same one they had just left behind. Inside the broken threshold of the ruins, the air changed in a way Ethan Walker could not immediately define. It was not colder, nor warmer, but heavier, as if the space itself had been sealed off from the rest of the world and left untouched for too long. Dust floated in slow motion through shafts of pale morning light that forced its way through fractured concrete above, painting the interior in uneven patterns of gray and gold. Shadow moved ahead without hesitation, his paws silent against the debris-covered floor, every step deliberate, every pause calculated. Ethan followed closely, boots carefully testing each piece of ground before committing his weight, his senses narrowing into a focused scan of angles, shadows, and potential structural weaknesses. The ruins were part of an old logistical command structure, now partially collapsed after years of abandonment, its corridors reduced to jagged openings and unstable passageways. Yet Shadow did not behave like he was entering something unfamiliar. He behaved like he was returning. Ethan noticed the shift immediately. The German shepherd's ears remained locked forward, but his breathing had changed, slower now, controlled, almost steady in a way that suggested recognition rather than alert. Ethan whispered his name once, low and steady, but Shadow did not respond. Instead, he turned slightly left, guiding them toward a narrow opening where a section of wall had fallen inward, creating a passage just wide enough for a single person to pass through at a time. Ethan paused at the edge, scanning the darkness beyond. No movement. No sound, only silence that felt too complete to be natural. He adjusted his position, letting his eyes adapt, counting seconds as his vision slowly began to separate shapes from Shadow. Shadow stepped through first. Ethan followed, entering a corridor where the ceiling had partially collapsed, leaving exposed steel beams twisted like frozen lightning above them. The air carried a faint scent of dust and aged concrete, but beneath it was something else. Something subtle that made Shadow's focus sharpen further. The dog stopped again, this time lowering his head closer to the ground, inhaling slowly, as if confirming a memory. Ethan felt a tightening in his chest. Whatever had brought them here was not random. It had purpose, or at least intention. He scanned the corridor walls, noting markings left behind from previous structural assessments, faded caution symbols, and remnants of equipment that had not been removed before abandonment. The space felt like a place paused in time, waiting for a moment that never came. Shadow took another step forward, and then another, moving deeper into the structure. Ethan kept pace, careful not to break alignment with the dog's trajectory. Then, without warning, Shadow stopped completely. His body stiffened, not aggressively, but with a sudden stillness that made Ethan immediately freeze as well. The corridor ahead opened into a wider chamber, partially illuminated by a broken skylight above. Dust particles drifted in slow spirals through the light beams, revealing fragments of collapsed interior structures. Ethan's eyes tracked the space carefully, moving left to right, bottom to top, searching for anything out of place. At first, there was nothing. Then Shadow shifted slightly, angling his head toward the far corner of the chamber. Ethan followed the direction of his gaze. At first, he saw only debris, broken panels, and sections of collapsed shelving. But then he noticed a subtle irregularity, something that did not belong to the randomness of destruction. A faint movement, barely perceptible. He held his breath instinctively, not out of fear, but out of focus, narrowing everything down to that single point. Shadow took one slow step forward, then stopped again, as if waiting for Ethan to confirm what he already knew. Ethan moved carefully closer, each step deliberate, controlled, his training guiding him to avoid unnecessary noise or sudden motion. The closer he got, the clearer the detail became. It was not debris. It was not equipment. It was something alive, barely distinguishable from its surroundings, resting behind a fallen structural panel that had created a small pocket of shelter within the destruction. Ethan's heartbeat remained steady, but his awareness sharpened to its highest point. Shadow let out a quiet exhale, not a bark, not a growl, but something softer, almost relieved. Ethan knelt slightly, adjusting his angle of view, and that was when he saw it clearly enough to understand why Shadow had come here without hesitation. The realization did not come with shock or panic, but with a deep, grounding seriousness that settled into his thoughts like weight. Whatever this was, it had been here long enough to be forgotten by the world outside, but not long enough to be forgotten by the one creature standing beside him. Shadow did not move closer. He simply stayed still, watching, as if confirming that what he had found was real and that they had arrived in time. Shadow remained still for several seconds, his body perfectly aligned with the faint direction of whatever lay beyond the collapsed panel. Ethan Walker could feel the weight of that stillness pressing into the space between them, a kind of silent communication that did not require command or explanation. The chamber ahead was quiet in a way that felt intentional, as if even the air had learned to wait. Ethan lowered himself slightly, scanning the irregular opening formed by the fallen structure. The light from the fractured skylight above revealed just enough detail to distinguish shape from chaos, but not enough to make assumptions. Shadow shifted his front paw forward by only a few inches, then stopped again, his head angled downward, ears locked forward with precise focus. Ethan followed his gaze carefully, moving one step at a time, controlling his breathing, allowing his eyes to adjust to the uneven contrast of shadow and light. At first, it looked like nothing more than collapsed material, layers of broken concrete, and bent metal resting in unnatural angles. But then he saw it again, that same subtle irregularity he had noticed moments earlier. A faint rise and fall, so slight it could have been mistaken for shifting dust. Ethan froze completely, his attention narrowing to that single point. Shadow did not move closer, but his posture changed. There was no tension in him, no aggression, only a steady presence that suggested recognition and certainty. Ethan slowly lowered himself further, bringing his line of sight closer to the ground level where the collapsed panel created a small, enclosed space. The air here felt different, not in temperature, but in density, as if something fragile had been preserved within it. He could now clearly see that there was a sheltered pocket beneath the debris, formed naturally by the way the structure had fallen. Within that space, partially obscured but unmistakably present, was a figure resting against the wall of broken concrete. Ethan did not rush forward. He held position, assessing first, as training had conditioned him to do. The figure was still, but not entirely motionless. There was movement, subtle and inconsistent, suggesting awareness rather than unconsciousness. Shadow finally stepped forward one pace, then stopped beside Ethan, his head lowering slightly, as if acknowledging presence rather than investigating it. Ethan spoke softly, his voice controlled and steady, not loud enough to disturb the fragile balance of the space. There was no response, but the faint movement continued, confirming that whoever was there was still conscious. Ethan carefully adjusted his position, moving to a safer angle where he could see more clearly without disturbing the structure around them. The light from above shifted slightly as clouds passed overhead, allowing a softer illumination into the chamber. It revealed more detail. The figure was a civilian, dressed in clothing that had been covered in dust from the surrounding environment. Their posture suggested exhaustion, but also endurance, as if they had been waiting for something or someone for a long time. Shadow remained focused, his gaze locked on the figure without hesitation. Ethan noticed something else then, something that made his attention sharpen further. The space around the figure had been intentionally cleared, as if they had created their own small area of protection within the collapse, avoiding unstable debris and positioning themselves beneath the strongest remaining structural support. It was not random survival. It was awareness. Ethan felt a shift in his understanding. This was not simply a case of chance or accident. There had been intention, adaptation, and time. He moved one step closer, then stopped again, maintaining distance while ensuring stability of the surrounding debris. Shadow remained steady, his breathing calm but attentive, as if confirming that the situation was exactly what he had been guiding them toward from the beginning. The figure shifted slightly, a small movement of the head, enough to indicate awareness of their presence. Ethan held his position and spoke again, quieter this time, using a calm tone designed to avoid triggering panic. There was a pause, a long one, where nothing moved except dust drifting through the light. Then, slowly, the figure responded with a faint motion, lifting their head just enough to acknowledge that they were no longer alone. Shadow took one final step forward and stopped at Ethan's side, no longer leading, but standing with him, as if the mission that had brought them here had reached its first and most important truth. Ethan exhaled slowly, his focus steady, as the realization settled fully into place that what they had followed was not an accident, but a signal that had been waiting to be understood. The silence inside the collapsed chamber shifted in a way that Ethan Walker immediately noticed, not as sound, but as change. The faint movement he had seen before was now slightly more defined, as if the figure resting beneath the broken structure had gathered enough awareness to understand they were no longer alone. Ethan remained still, maintaining a careful balance between readiness and restraint. Shadow stood beside him, unwavering, his amber eyes locked forward with a calm intensity that carried no hesitation. The space felt suspended, like time itself had narrowed into this single moment of recognition. Ethan adjusted his stance slowly, ensuring he did not disturb the unstable surroundings. Small fragments of dust continued to fall from the fractured ceiling above, drifting through shafts of pale light that illuminated the scene in uneven patterns. The figure beneath the debris shifted again, this time more deliberate, lifting their heads slightly higher. Ethan could now clearly identify that it was a young civilian male, his clothing worn and coated in fine dust, his posture suggesting both exhaustion and determination to remain conscious. There was no immediate danger in his movements, only the careful awareness of someone who had survived longer than expected under difficult conditions. Ethan spoke softly, his voice steady and controlled, designed to avoid creating tension in an already fragile environment. The figure did not respond verbally, but the subtle motion of his head indicated he was listening. Shadow took one slow step forward and then stopped again, positioning himself slightly ahead of Ethan but not fully entering the confined space. His behavior remained consistent, not reactive, but observant, as if confirming every detail before allowing further action. Ethan noticed something else now, a detail that had been hidden in earlier moments of uncertainty. The figure had arranged pieces of debris around himself in a way that suggested awareness of structural safety, avoiding unstable sections and positioning himself beneath reinforced sections of the collapsed chamber. It was not random survival behavior. It was intentional adaptation. Ethan felt a quiet shift in his understanding of the situation. This was not simply a case of someone trapped and waiting. There had been effort involved in staying alive, effort that required presence of mind even under difficult conditions. He carefully lowered himself further, adjusting his angle of observation to ensure stability in the surrounding debris. The chamber remained silent except for the faint settling of dust and the distant hum of wind passing. Through broken openings above, Shadow remained motionless, but his focus intensified, his posture indicating recognition of something beyond simple detection. Ethan moved one step closer, stopping at a safe distance where he could see the figure clearly without disturbing the structure. The young man's eyes were partially open now, adjusting to the light and movement in front of him. There was no fear in his expression, only exhaustion and a quiet awareness of being found. Ethan maintained his calm posture, offering presence rather than urgency, allowing the moment to unfold without pressure. The environment around them remained unstable in appearance, but not actively shifting, which allowed for controlled movement, if necessary. Shadow finally lowered his head slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, as if confirming that the purpose of their arrival had been fulfilled to this point. Ethan exhaled slowly, keeping his attention fully engaged with both the surroundings and the person in front of him. The situation had transitioned from search to contact, from uncertainty to recognition. The ruins that had once felt empty now carried a clear sense of meaning, as if they had been waiting to reveal this exact moment. Ethan held his position, ensuring stability, awareness, and calm control as the connection between all three of them settled into place, without words. The moment settled into a quiet stability that Ethan Walker did not allow himself to trust too quickly. Inside the collapsed chamber, everything felt still, but in his experience stillness was never the same as safety. He maintained his position beside the young civilian, carefully observing every small movement, every change in breathing, every subtle shift of awareness. The young man's eyes were now more open, adjusting to the dim light filtering through the fractured structure above. There was no panic, only fatigue and the slow return of orientation. Ethan kept his voice low and steady, offering simple reassurance without overwhelming the moment. Shadow remained close, positioned slightly forward but no longer advancing. His posture had softened in a way Ethan recognized from previous missions, a sign that the immediate urgency had passed, replaced by confirmation and presence. The German shepherd's gaze remained fixed on the young man, not in a predatory sense, but in a focused and protective way, as if ensuring that the situation remained stable. Ethan slowly shifted his weight, carefully testing the ground beneath him. The structure held firm, though small fragments of dust continued to fall from above with each distant shift of air. The environment remained fragile, but not actively deteriorating. He adjusted his radio lightly, considering whether to call for extraction support, but paused, choosing instead to assess the full condition of the scene before escalating. The young man attempted a slight movement, lifting one arm minimally, as if to signal awareness. Ethan immediately responded with calm instruction, keeping his tone even and controlled. There was no urgency in his voice, only guidance, designed to maintain stability in a situation where sudden emotion could easily disrupt fragile balance. Shadow responded subtly to the shift in attention, stepping half a pace closer, then stopping again as Ethan extended a hand gently, not touching, but offering presence and reassurance. The young man blinked slowly, focusing on Ethan, then briefly shifting his gaze toward Shadow. There was a moment of recognition that seemed less intellectual and more instinctive, as if something in the presence of the German shepherd carried meaning beyond immediate explanation. Ethan noticed this and remained silent, allowing the moment to unfold naturally without interruption. The chamber around them remained unchanged, but the atmosphere within it had shifted significantly. What had begun as uncertainty had now become connection. Ethan observed the young man more carefully, noting signs of dehydration and prolonged exposure, but no immediate visible injury that required urgent movement. This allowed him to maintain a controlled approach rather than rushing extraction. He spoke again, gently, asking simple questions designed to ground awareness. The young man responded faintly, his voice weak but coherent enough to confirm understanding. Shadow lowered his head slightly again, positioning himself closer to the young man's side, not touching but remaining within a protective distance that suggested instinctive guardianship. Ethan recognized that behavior clearly. It was not training alone that produced such precision. It was something deeper, something built through repeated shared experience. He allowed himself a brief moment to scan the surroundings once more, ensuring no secondary hazards were present. The broken structure above remained stable, and the surrounding debris showed no sign of shifting. Light continued to filter through in thin, shifting beams, illuminating dust particles that moved slowly through the air like suspended time. The young man attempted another small movement, this time more controlled, adjusting his posture slightly against the debris behind him. Ethan immediately observed and confirmed that the movement did not compromise stability. He maintained his calm stance, allowing the situation to continue evolving without disruption. Shadow remained steady, his presence constant and unwavering, acting as a silent anchor within the confined space. Ethan felt the weight of the moment not as tension, but as responsibility, understanding that what they had found here was not just survival, but endurance shaped by time and isolation. He prepared mentally for the next phase of response, ensuring that every action would remain deliberate and controlled, as the quiet connection between all three figures in the ruins continued to strengthen without words. The chamber remained quiet in a way that no longer felt uncertain, but carefully held together by the awareness of everyone inside it. Ethan Walker stayed in a controlled position beside the young civilian, maintaining a steady visual sweep of the surroundings while keeping his attention divided between immediate safety and human condition. The faint light filtering through the fractured ceiling continued to shift slowly as clouds moved overhead, casting soft changes across the debris-filled space. Shadow remained close, his posture calm but alert, positioned in a way that naturally formed a protective boundary between Ethan and the young man resting against the broken structure. There was no urgency in his movement now, only presence, as if the initial purpose of their arrival had transitioned into something more stable and defined. Ethan observed the young man carefully, noting the gradual improvement in awareness. His breathing, though still weak, had become more consistent. His eyes followed movement more clearly now, adjusting between Ethan and Shadow with growing recognition. Ethan kept his voice low and steady, offering brief reassurance without overwhelming the fragile calm of the moment. The young man responded with small movements, subtle nods that indicated understanding rather than strength. Shadow shifted slightly closer, not intruding, but aligning himself in a way that kept him within immediate proximity. Ethan noticed the behavior and recognized it as more than instinct. It was continuity of focus, a consistent decision to remain engaged with the subject at the center of attention. He adjusted his stance carefully, ensuring that his weight distribution remained stable on the uneven ground. The surrounding structure remained unchanged, but the sense of space had shifted further into something controlled rather than uncertain. Dust continued to drift through narrow beams of light, creating a slow visual rhythm that contrasted with the stillness of the figures below. Ethan reached for his radio again, hesitating briefly as he assessed whether external support would disrupt the stability already established. After a moment, he decided to maintain current position, prioritizing continuity of calm over immediate escalation. The young man attempted a slight repositioning of his upper body, adjusting against the debris behind him with clear effort but no distress. Ethan immediately responded with a steady verbal cue, guiding him to remain still while confirming that no structural shift had occurred. Shadow lowered his head briefly, then returned to a neutral position, maintaining his silent watch. There was a growing sense of synchronization between all three presence points within the chamber, as if the environment itself had adjusted to accommodate their shared focus. Ethan took a careful glance upward, scanning the fractured ceiling once more. The structural integrity appeared consistent, with no new movement or shifting debris. This allowed him to maintain his current position without initiating immediate extraction procedures. The young man's breathing steadied further, and his gaze remained fixed on Ethan with increasing clarity. There was no fear in his expression now, only quiet awareness and the slow return of orientation. Ethan maintained his calm presence, understanding that rapid change was unnecessary and could disrupt the stability already achieved. Shadow remained unwavering, positioned slightly forward, acting not as a responder to threat, but as a constant stabilizing presence. Ethan felt the weight of responsibility not as pressure, but as precision, knowing that every decision made in this space required balance between caution and care. The chamber, once uncertain and fragmented, now held a quiet equilibrium that allowed time to move forward without resistance. Ethan remained ready for the next phase, ensuring that awareness, stability, and control were maintained as the situation continued to evolve in silence. Time inside the chamber seemed to slow as Ethan Walker maintained his steady position beside the young civilian. The quiet stability that had formed was no longer fragile in appearance, but carefully sustained by the awareness of everyone present. Ethan kept his focus divided between the immediate environment and the condition of the person in front of him. The young man's breathing had improved slightly, becoming more consistent, and his eyes now followed movement with clearer intention. Shadow remained in place just ahead of Ethan, his posture unchanged, calm yet attentive, as if anchoring the space through presence alone. There was no urgency in his movements, only a continuous, steady focus that reflected recognition and understanding of the situation as it had evolved. Ethan observed carefully, noting the subtle improvements in responsiveness. The young man attempted a small shift in position, adjusting his shoulder against the debris behind him. Ethan immediately responded with a calm instruction, ensuring the movement did not disturb the surrounding structure. Dust continued to drift slowly through the fractured beams of light above, creating a soft visual rhythm across the broken surfaces of the chamber. The environment itself remained unchanged, but the perception of it had shifted from uncertainty to controlled stillness. Ethan adjusted his stance slightly, maintaining a stable base while continuing to monitor both structural integrity and human condition. Shadow briefly lowered his head, then returned to a neutral position, maintaining constant awareness without advancing further. Ethan reached for his radio once more, considering whether external support should be initiated, but paused again, choosing instead to maintain current control over the situation until a clearer transition point presented itself. The young man's gaze moved between Ethan and Shadow with increasing clarity, showing signs of full awareness returning. There was no distress in his expression now, only quiet observation and gradual reorientation. Ethan maintained a steady tone when speaking, offering simple and direct reassurance to keep the situation grounded. Shadow shifted his weight slightly, aligning his position to remain between Ethan and the deeper part of the chamber, maintaining a protective orientation without signs of agitation. Ethan recognized the consistency in that behavior, understanding it as a continuous commitment to stability rather than reaction to threat. The space around them remained structurally unchanged, though faint settling sounds from the upper debris indicated the natural aging of the environment rather than active movement. Ethan kept his attention focused on detail, scanning for any shift that could alter their position or require immediate response. The young man attempted a slightly more deliberate movement, lifting his head further and adjusting his posture in a controlled manner. Ethan observed closely, ensuring that no instability was triggered by the motion. Shadow remained still, his gaze steady and fixed, as if confirming that the situation had entered a phase of safe observation rather than urgent intervention. Ethan felt a subtle shift in the overall atmosphere, not from external change, but from the internal stabilization of all three presences within the chamber. The initial uncertainty that had defined their entry was now replaced with a sustained calm that allowed for careful evaluation and measured response. He continued to hold position, ensuring that every element of the environment remained accounted for, as the quiet equilibrium between human awareness, structural stability, and instinctive presence continued to hold without disruption. The chamber held its silence in a way that now felt stable rather than uncertain, as if the space itself had accepted the presence of those inside it and chosen not to resist further. Ethan Walker maintained his controlled position beside the young civilian, keeping his posture steady and his attention divided between immediate observation and environmental awareness. The young man's breathing had become more consistent, and his movements, though still limited by fatigue, showed clear signs of recovery in awareness and orientation. Shadow remained in his established position slightly forward of Ethan, his stance unchanged, calm and deliberate, with no indication of tension or urgency. His presence continued to act as a steady anchor within the confined environment, maintaining focus on the young civilian without shifting attention elsewhere. Ethan observed the subtle changes carefully, noting how the young man's eyes now tracked movement more precisely, adjusting between Ethan and Shadow with growing clarity. The fractured light from above continued to drift through the broken structure, illuminating dust particles that moved slowly through the air, creating a quiet visual rhythm that matched the stillness of the chamber. Ethan adjusted his stance slightly, ensuring balance on the uneven ground while continuing to monitor structural integrity. There were no signs of movement in the surrounding debris, only natural settling that did not affect stability. He kept his voice low when speaking, offering brief and controlled reassurance to maintain calm focus in the young civilian's condition. Shadow shifted his head slightly, then returned to stillness, maintaining his protective orientation without advancing or retreating. Ethan briefly considered communication through his radio, evaluating whether external extraction support should be initiated, but chose to delay the call, prioritizing continued stabilization within the current environment. The young man attempted a small adjustment in posture, lifting his head slightly higher than before, showing improved strength in maintaining awareness. Ethan observed this carefully, ensuring that the movement did not disturb surrounding debris or compromise safety. Shadow remained steady, his gaze fixed forward, fully aware of both Ethan and the young civilian, maintaining constant situational awareness without visible agitation. The chamber remained unchanged in structure, though faint ambient sounds of settling material could occasionally be detected at a distance, indicating long-term instability rather than immediate threat. Ethan maintained full situational control, scanning continuously across the space for any deviation in condition. The young man's gaze stabilized, focusing more consistently on Ethan, indicating increased cognitive clarity and reduced disorientation. Ethan continued to hold position, offering calm presence without unnecessary movement or instruction, allowing the situation to stabilize naturally. Shadow's posture remained unchanged, reinforcing the controlled equilibrium that had formed within the chamber. There was a growing sense of structured calm, not imposed but established through sustained awareness and mutual presence. Ethan recognized that the environment had transitioned fully from uncertainty into managed stability, where each participant maintained their role within a balanced and silent coordination. He remained ready for any shift, but at this moment, no shift occurred, only sustained stillness and controlled recovery within the quiet interior of the ruins. The quiet inside the chamber had evolved into something Ethan Walker no longer needed to interpret, only maintain. Every element within the space now seemed aligned in a fragile but functional balance, as if the environment, the human presence, and the trained instinct of the German Shepherd had reached a shared understanding. Ethan remained steady beside the young civilian, his posture controlled, his attention still divided between observation and situational awareness, though the immediate sense of uncertainty had fully dissolved. The young man's breathing was now even, slow but consistent, and his eyes remained open with clear recognition of his surroundings. He was no longer searching for meaning in the confusion of survival, but instead adjusting to the reality of being found. Shadow stood in his familiar position slightly ahead of Ethan, calm and unmoving, his focus unwavering but no longer tense. There was no indication of urgency in his posture, only a sustained presence that mirrored the stability of the moment itself. Ethan observed the subtle coordination between them, recognizing how naturally the space had adapted to their positions. The fractured light above continued to shift gently through the broken structure, casting long, soft patterns across the debris-filled chamber. Dust still drifted in slow motion, but even that movement felt distant now, like a background rhythm rather than a signal of instability. Ethan slowly adjusted his stance, confirming once more that the surrounding structure remained unchanged. No new shifts, no falling fragments, only the quiet endurance of an abandoned place that had already given up its former function. He reached for his radio and paused briefly, then activated it with a calm, controlled transmission, requesting extraction support with clear and measured detail. His voice remained steady, without urgency, reflecting the stability of the situation on site. After the transmission, he returned full attention to the young civilian. The young man responded with a small movement of acknowledgement, his gaze steadying on Ethan with increasing clarity and reduced fatigue. There was no panic in his expression now, only quiet awareness and gradual reorientation to safety. Ethan offered a brief verbal reassurance, keeping his tone low and consistent, reinforcing the stability already present rather than attempting to alter it. Shadow shifted slightly, repositioning his weight in a subtle adjustment that maintained his protective orientation while acknowledging the change in status. He did not move closer or further away, but remained precisely where he was, as if marking the boundary of safety itself. Ethan recognized this behavior as final confirmation that the immediate purpose of their presence here had transitioned from discovery to recovery. The chamber felt different now, not physically, but perceptually, as if the tension that had once defined it had been gently replaced by a controlled stillness. The young civilian attempted one final small adjustment in posture, sitting more upright with visible effort, but no distress. Ethan monitored the movement closely, confirming that it did not affect surrounding stability. Everything remained secure. The fractured structure above held steady, and the debris beneath them remained unchanged. Shadow's gaze remained fixed forward, calm and constant, his presence now functioning less as a response mechanism and more as a stabilizing force within the environment. Ethan allowed himself a moment of still observation, not of analysis, but of acknowledgement. The situation had reached a point of resolution, not through force or urgency, but through careful alignment of awareness, instinct, and time. The young civilian was conscious, stable, and responsive. The environment, though broken, was no longer threatening, and Shadow remained as he had from the beginning, unwavering in purpose, grounded in presence, and fully aligned with the quiet outcome of their journey into the ruins. Ethan maintained his position, ready for extraction procedures, while the chamber settled into a silence that no longer carried uncertainty, only the calm recognition that what had been found here would now move safely toward recovery.